first met Mickey at TSU when I was a sophomore. Mickey was an activist, very much involved in everything that was going on at the school. He was also involved with politics, as you can imagine. This was also during the time of a lot of engagement and activism that took place on college campuses all across the country. And Mickey was literally at the forefront of all of this. In the early 80s, Mickey called me and said that he wanted to meet with me. I wasn't sure what he wanted to meet with me about, but I soon find out that he had done his homework on me. It was through that process that I really got to be, I would say, a good personal friend with Mickey. Mickey was actually probably one of my first real true mentors, and especially when it came to understanding those of us who have been blessed, that it was important how we give back. And Mickey was the first person who somewhat ingrained that into me, other than from my pastors and things along those lines. But from a standpoint, his mission was a little bit different. His mission was also understanding, Gerald, you have an obligation to your community. You have an obligation to give back, not only from a standpoint from how you give back philanthropically, which was important, but also from a standpoint how you can help to empower others through the political process. And that's how Mickey really got me involved. Interesting to note, I remember the first time that Mickey asked me to write a check, a political contribution to his campaign. And he told me, he says, I want you to write a check to my campaign for $1,000. Now you have to understand, this was mid-80s, early 80s, mid-80s. I can't remember exactly when it was, but to me, back then, $1,000 was a lot of money. But he talked to me in a manner that this wasn't just from a standpoint of doing something for him, but it was also, more importantly, in how I could help him in doing better work for the community. And so for me, while it felt like it was a stretch for me, it really wasn't. But once I did it, I realized that this was also the right thing to do. And Mickey had a thing about putting those of us who were a little bit younger than he was. I'm about 6 years younger. I was about 6 years younger, but that's why I say he was something of a mentor to me. But it was people like myself, Milton Carroll, and others that became kind of his young entourage. He had many entourages, by the way. And when I say entourage, I don't mean that in a manner where people, followed him around or anything like that, but from a standpoint of different groups that he nurtured, and to understand that our role, while we didn't even realize it at the time, eventually we were going to be the next new leaders here in this city. And Mickey knew that before any of us knew that. And that was the thing that was so profound about Mickey. Mickey was a visionary. He saw things that we didn't even know about ourselves, but he saw it even before we saw it in ourselves. And so when he came to me and talked to me about the role that I should be playing, I said, Mickey, I'm just a banker, investment banker. I'm just not. He said, Gerald, you have to understand, you're going to be playing a much broader role. And your role not only is going to transcend just the business side, but you need to also be involved politically. And Mickey was the first person to make me understand that. And not only me, but I know others as well, that he had that same profound effect on. I can recall when Mickey left for Ethiopia. Anita and Allison were pregnant, both at that time. Obviously, Allison with the twins. Anita was pregnant with our first son, Jackson. And we had made this pledge that when Mickey got back, that we were all going to go, once he got back from this trip from Ethiopia, we had plans to all fly together, Anita, Allison, Mickey, and I, to California, to San Francisco, to celebrate while the wives could still fly. And as we know, in August of 1989, Mickey did not return from that trip. That was one of the most devastating time, and obviously not only in my mind and in my memory, but it's a history that I will never forget, because he had become really and truly not only a very good friend, but a very close confidant. And to lose him was something that to this day that I think about all the time. And clearly around this time, well, it's about a month past now, but towards the end of August of every year. And this year, as you know, was 30 years ago of his passing. The one thing that just recalling the services at Texas Southern, the wooden coffin, and the whole aspect of here's a man that clearly was a person of the people. Mickey lived his life that way, and even in death, he was buried that way as a person of the people. His homegoing services were probably, from a standpoint of any service that I have attended, the most memorable. A lot of joy, a lot of sadness, but it really dealt with the reality of what we had lost in Mickey. You know, we all know that life goes on, but with Mickey, life still goes on, because Mickey, the impressions that he has had on me, and I know of others, is kind of like what we live our life by today. And it's like, what would Mickey do? What would Mickey say? What would Mickey want us to do? Still lives on today, 30 years after his death. He is truly a person that lives on, and I would hope that this video, for the young people who really didn't know him, would really get a great understanding that he truly was a man of the world, and he cared about each and every fellow human being.
My name is Rashid Masovin. I have the honor and the privilege to be the Dean of College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences here at Texas Southern University. I'm sitting in Gray Hall in the Dean's Conference Room speaking with you. The Dean's Conference Room, as I hope would many of you come and visit, has a plaque of Mr. Mickey Leland on the door. This conference room is named after him. And it is a privilege for me to conduct the business of this College of Pharmacy and Health Science in a conference room with a leadership team, a conference room in which it is named after him. We all know the history. We know the history of this legend and what this man has done for humanity. He cared about the poor, he cared about the hungry, and I think everybody knows those details of what he has achieved and what he's done, both at the Texas Legislature and then later in Washington, D.C. But what I want to spend a couple of minutes and talk to you about is the efforts that he made to make generic drug substitution in the state of Texas, and later federally, more possible for all patients. Because as we all know today in 2021, that generic medications are so much more affordable to patients, especially patients with lower income, less access, less insurance. But the efforts really began with Mr. Mickey Leland back in the very early 80s in Washington, D.C., to make sure that the pharmacists are allowed to make some of those substitutions. Because for those of you who may remember, it was very, very difficult back then. There was a lot of hurdles. If a physician wrote for a medication, it would be nearly impossible at times, even when a generic substitute was available, for the pharmacist to quickly help the patient. So here we got to thank once again, among many, many things that Mr. Leland did for this community, for the global community, what I wanted to remind everybody on the celebration of his birthday is his efforts on making sure that the generic medication substitutions are easier to perform by pharmacists. And as you all know, he was a pharmacist. He graduated from this very same school. This is his effort. So we want to celebrate him and celebrate his accomplishments. And thank you for being with me this afternoon.
My name is Ben Reyes. I was a member of the Texas Legislature at the same time Mickey Leland was, a member of City Council. He and I were friends all our lives. And I met him when I was a kid over on Lyons Avenue. I used to shine shoes and he used to work at the Dairy Dream. I could get extra hamburger meat on my hamburgers and get a big malt from Mickey. That's how we first met, and we continued being friends till after I got back from Vietnam. He started running for the legislature, encouraged me to run, and I ran, and we were friends all of his life. One of the things that was really important about Mickey, that Mickey was really Mickey, and that's all he was. He was a person that loved people, and he didn't just go out there and espouse the whole notion that we needed to coalesce as back then it was called the Black-Brown coalitions. He did exactly that. He did it by what he did, of how he acted. He used to get in trouble in the black community because they said, Mickey, you're doing more for the Mexicans than you're doing for us. And he taught me that way. He taught me that in order to live a coalition and make it go, you had to be that kind of person. You had to be that kind of human being. You had to be what you said you were. And I think that's the way he lived all of his life, regardless of whether it was in politics, whether it was in school, whether it was out in the community. And he showed the people in my community by going out and putting up clinics in Port Houston, one of the poorest Hispanic communities, in North Side, Casa de Amigos. And nobody had ever done stuff like that. He did it. He didn't do it because there was any publicity about it. He did it because he was a human being of the world, and he was a person that would really believe in, if we can come together as poor people, as working people, we can achieve a lot more together than we can by ourselves. The story that's probably the most interest about this era that we were involved in, because you had to remember the Texas legislature maybe had 1 or 2 blacks in the legislature, maybe 6 or 7 Mexicans, and they were guys from the valley. They had never met anybody from the cities. And the rest were people from the country. And the first day that we went up to the legislature, Craig was driving his Cadillac, had the top down. Mickey was sitting next to him, and I was in the back. And we drove in, and we were driving around the Capitol there, and said, man, where should we park? Craig says, I said, park right there, Craig. That sign says, for members of the legislature. And he parked. He said, yeah, we'll park right by the door. And he parked. And this little security guard, who we found out later they were retired DPS policemen, came up to the door, to Craig's door, and he said, hey, boy, damn, don't you know that you ain't supposed to park around here? He says, so Craig plays along. Craig, intelligent, one of the best lawyers I've ever known. We played along with him. He said, no, sir, boss, I just park in here, get to the door, it's closest. He said, well, can't you read that sign up over there? It says, members of the legislature only. Now you get your ass across the street over there and find your parking space and rent your place. He said, well, boss, I think I is a member of the legislature. And that little old guy shook his head, and then Craig said, no, all of us is members, all 3 of us is members of the legislature, him and that guy in the back. And that old guy started shaking his head, God damn, the country's going to the dogs. Get him out of here, and he took off. Anyway, the guy quit the next day, and that was our introduction into the Texas legislature. That's how we kind of started. The word got around all over the place. The guy quit, And we made him quit, and we did make him quit because it scared the shit out of him. And that's where it was, and that's what we did. That's where we were. We were not afraid to take him on, and we told him we're not. It's like when that one guy from Midland, Texas, called Symphonia colored or some crazy ass name back in the back of the chamber, and Symphonia got up on personal privilege and ripped that boy. He almost cried on the House floor. He's a rich white boy with a lot of oil money from Midland, Texas. That boy damn near cried, and he couldn't stand to look people in the eyes after what she did to him. Chastised him about calling her this, calling her that. The guy quit the legislature too. But we had to do that. We just had to because they'd never been there. I mean, the only one that ever been there is Barbara Jordan and Curtis Graves. And both of them were gone. Barbara had gone to Congress, and Curtis had run for some lieutenant governor's position or something. So it was just us. But we had help because we had the Ragsdales from Dallas. We had people from Beaumont, Texas that were our kind of folks. We had more people from the Valley that were different than the kind of the old Mexicans that were the rich Mexicans from the Valley that came to the legislature. We had some just regular guys like Carlos Truan. But I think that we all went in an era where we had to turn the country around, we had to turn the state around, and we went about doing that. Not just there, because Mickey didn't just stop there. Mickey would go on the national level. He'd go throughout the state of Texas, and I think slowly his message that we had to bring our people together, we had to coalesce, we had to work together, because separated we couldn't do nothing, but together we were a force to be reckoned, whether we were in Lubbock, Texas, whether we were in Austin, Texas, or whether we were in Houston or Dallas. And I think that's what he did. I went to work all over the Hispanic community, including in Los Angeles, California, where they didn't have single-member districts. We created single-member districts. And we thought that whole notion of getting local representation would make the difference. And the single-member district case came out of Texas, White v. Register. And we carried that case all over the country. The guys in Los Angeles created single-member districts at the city, and then they went from that to the school board. Because as you remember back in the days that we started, before we started, I don't think we had but one minority on the school board in HISD, and that was Miss White. And that's because they thought she was white, because she was Miss White. But we never had a Hispanic. My sister was a Harvard Ph.D., and she got elected, the first Hispanic woman, to the school board. And it took that kind of direct action on our parts. But really all of it was Mickey. All of it was Mickey because he was a thread that held both our communities together. One of the things that was really Mickey Leland, because he was a pharmacist, he was concerned about health care. He worked real hard for community clinics. And you got to understand, community clinics, generic substitutions, HMOs, back in them days was communist. You had to be a crazy communist that wanted to get them kind of things done. But his mind was so far ahead of everybody else, and it was all about helping the most people with the least amount of money. And he was always there, and he fought that generic substitution bill in the legislature, and I swear people thought they walked up to him and called him a communist, and they told me he was crazy, that he's going to turn all that over to the communists, and Lord and behold, all he was trying to do was have access for poor people to the medicines they needed at a lower price. That's all generic substitution was about. That's all HMOs was about. And local neighborhood clinics, he was the architect of all that. Casa de Amigos was the first one. The second one was over at Port Houston, big Hispanic communities. That showed you who he was. He didn't run the 5th Ward. He didn't run the 3rd Ward. He ran to where he thought he could bring more people together. And he absolutely did that. And what happened after that was that everybody benefited from generic substitutions. Everybody, all poor people in the world benefited from it, especially in this country. He was that far ahead of everybody. He was like 20, 30 years ahead on his thinking about helping people with their health care. You argue about health care, that guy did it. The reason we got neighborhood clinics in Houston, Harris County right now, because he told them, he says, do you want to treat those people in their neighborhood and give them a shot for the flu, or you want them to get pneumonia and go to Ben Taub or go to Jeff Davis back in them days and spend thousands of dollars more? That don't make no sense. And they finally figured he's right. And that's where we got neighborhood clinics. And it was good for everybody. It was good for the community because it saved a lot of money. And more than that, it was good for the people because they got well. They were able to be healthy people and productive. They weren't tied up in a hospital somewhere downtown fighting to stay alive. That was Mickey Leland. That's what he was all about. And all those things, he was 25 years ahead of everybody. When all that got done, HMOs, neighborhood clinics, everybody said, oh my God, the greatest thing since apple pie. They didn't understand it. It got through Mickey Leland, and he fought hard in the legislature. Them old country boys were tough on him. And everybody that was anti-communist back in them days beat up on him. But he stood his ground. And you see what we got now. Go out there and look at it. That's Mickey Leland. The congressional race for the 18th Congressional District was really important to me because it was important to Mickey. He wanted to be that leader in the community, not because he wanted to lead in legislation in Congress or he wanted to be a congressman, but because he really felt that if he were in that position, he could bring even more people together. He could take his message all over the world, and he did. And his whole idea was he wasn't just worried about Mickey Leland's neighborhoods. He was worried about everybody. It's a tough deal, though, because there were a lot of people in the black community running, and it pretty well drew the lines all over the neighborhoods. It didn't bother our community. In our community, we loved Mickey Leland, and we was for Mickey Leland regardless of what he ran for or what he did. And we were that way because he was who he was. He was who he said he was. You looked at him and that's who you saw. That's what you got. You got that kind of a human being. And we worked our hearts off for him in that race. It was tough. But in the end, he got about 90% of the Hispanic vote, and I think that made a lot of difference in that race. It's tough for him, but he did what he had always done. He said, I'm reaching out to everybody, and I'm going to represent everybody. And our community believed him because we'd had years with him in the legislature, and we stuck with him. And after the division in the black community, people came together behind him because he was the kind of guy that reached out and brought people in and made the world a better place. Because he did. After he got in Congress, he headed up the hunger committees. And who does that help? All the people. All people struggling like our folks. And we applauded him. We thought it was the greatest thing he could do because that's what he was capable of doing, and we knew he was capable of doing it because he did it here. He never forgot our community. He never forgot our people. And you can go to this day to some of the senior citizen centers and some of the ones that are still out there, still love him. They still remember him. And that's what, he was really a genuine human being that practiced what he preached. And 90% of my community were Catholics. And to find out that he was a Catholic too just made their bond stronger. I mean, because of religion. In our community, religion was a big thing. I mean, just, especially if you were Catholic. Back in them days, that's sometimes all we had, but we were really tight with it. They were tight with us. And when they found out Mickey was a Catholic, they loved him even more. I think that the thing that all of us loved about Mickey is that he was genuine. He was who he said he was. And when you got Mickey Leland, you got the whole package. Whether you were Hispanic, whether you were white, whether you were African American, whether you were Asian, you got the whole deal. And his heart was out for human beings that needed help. And that's what that was all about. We loved him to the last minute.
I came to Houston in 1964. I was working for Prudential, an insurance company. I'd been in the military, done my 2 years there. I'd been back with Prue for 2 years, and they had a program to qualify to go to law school, and I had qualified. And so the two names my father had given me to call, one was a writer at the Chronicle, and the other was Mr. Mack Hanna. Mr. Mack and my dad had worked together in Jefferson County on South County welfare. And so I called Mr. Mack's office, and they said he sees his boys on Saturday morning, said be over here about 9 o'clock. Well, I got there, and it looked like a doctor's office, had all these people sitting around like in this living room here waiting. And he came out and said, y'all all know each other? And well, everyone there was a minority except me. I was the minority. And so Mickey Leland was one of them, and he was kind of the bell cow of the bunch, and he introduced me to guys sitting around. Benny Reyes was there, and Benny and I got to be good friends subsequently. In fact, everyone in that room we got to be friends. Craig Washington was there, and they were all looking at me. They didn't know who in the hell I was, and I didn't know who in the hell they were. So he met with a couple of other people who were there, and I can't remember who they were, but he had business with them, and he did that. And then he called us all in. He said, now y'all need to get to know each other. He said, I've known Jack's daddy, this long. I've known him since he was this high and down in Port Arthur. And he said, y'all are all going to be leaders, and we need leaders from each side of the community, and I expect that to happen. Well, Mr. Mack expects something to happen. It's going to happen. So things rocked along in about, I don't know, I'm in my, I guess, I ran for freshman class president and was elected because I'd been in the military and was older than most of my classmates. And so then the next year I ran for student bar president, and we took one of our freshmen who was a U of H undergraduate, and we ran him for president of the whole school. What motivated us so was there was a chief financial officer over there that I can't remember his name, don't want to, but he took all the money that the students put into all the machines, and we couldn't get any money out of him. He was using it for faculty and this, that, and the other. And I said, if I'm elected, we'll change that. And went to see Dr. Phil Hoffman. He said, well, you've got all of them talking about it. Said, you're not just running for student body president, you're running against my faculty over here. And I said, well, that's fine. I want it to be a fair fight. I had to go see him because I wanted to get a list of all the people there on the GI Bill. I was on the GI Bill. So I got those, and that was before faxes, and you mimeographed everything, and I wrote them all a letter, said, here's what's going on, we need your votes, here's our slate. And we ran a slate, and on election day, we won every damn office, and everybody was kind of looking around saying, what happened? So that put us in a position where we were running a school. Meanwhile, Mickey had closed down Wheeler Avenue. He said he didn't want any traffic through the campus. So we had all these guys that were working downtown, and they cut through Wheeler because that's the only way to get to U of H, because the Gulf Freeway was clogged worse than it is now. So one of our guys got pulled out of the car, and it beat him up pretty bad. And so they had another confrontation, and the guy knocked down one of the people trying to get him, just sped through in his car, knocked some kid down, hurt him. So there was, brouhaha about that. And I picked up the phone and called over there. And I said, are you the Mickey Leland that's the student body president? And Mickey was in his dashiki, elephant tail, fly swatter period, had his little round cap on. He was playing the part. And I had not seen him in a while. And I said, he said, well, we've shut it down. You just tell your people not to be coming through there. I said, well, Mickey, let's sit down and talk about it. I need to tell you, He said, okay. So we set up a meeting. So several of the guys at U of H Law School, we had a pretty good flag football team. Everybody had played in the Southwest Conference, and 3 or 4 of them were playing pro ball, and Don Truill was our quarterback. He was playing for the Oilers, or had played for the Oilers. So we had a pretty salty bunch of boys. So I got 3 of my linemen that were playing pro ball and took them with me because I knew how Mickey thought. And I didn't know Benny was going to be there. And I go in, here's Benny Reyes there, Craig Washington, Mickey's there. And he said, you know, let's just shut it down. We can't have that. And I said, well, we're not making a political statement about this. You let your students drive through there. Why can't you let our students that have a student sticker on it, kind of students honoring each other, because our campus abut, we'll have other issues we need to deal with, and we need to be able to work this out. He said, well, you've had my final word about that time. Benny says, could y'all excuse us for a minute? We need to caucus. And Mickey was obviously upset. And they leave, and they came back in. Mickey said, well, I've been thinking about what you said, Jack, and we're going to work this out. As long as your people have a student sticker identifying them as a student at U of H, we'll allow them to pass just like we do our students. I said, well, it's mighty generous of you. And the meeting was adjourned. We had no more problems. Now, flash forward to, I don't know, several years later, I had left the practice of law. I was building 3D International, and we acquired a company in Austin. I get a message to meet Frank Irwin, who was the big man on campus at UT and ran everything. He wanted to talk to me, and Frank had most of his meetings in various gin mills, and the old Quorum Club is where he was holding court. And I came walking in, I looked up there, and there's Mickey and Benny and all those guys. He said, y'all met before? And, you know, it's like old home week. And he wanted us to meet. He and I met for a few minutes and got what we were doing out of the way. And concerning that merger, he was advising the company we acquired. And you know, we all had scattered to go. I said, before we go, I said, Benny, Mickey, I got to know, we had that thing at TSU and y'all left the room and then you came back and everything was worked out. They looked at each other and laughed. And Mickey said, go ahead and tell him, Benny. Benny said, well, I told him, said, you know, he had been in Vietnam. And he said, all those crackers, they're holding. And said, nope, cover your ears. Those MFs will shoot your ass dead if you start trying to pull them out of the car. We don't want to go there. He said, well, we worked that thing out Jack was talking about those stickers. And that's how that deal came to pass. Benny intervened before there was bloodshed. But I had told him, I said, you know, our guys aren't making a statement. They're just guys with families trying to get an education so they can improve themselves. You know, now, give me some rules we can live with, but don't tell me we got to, you know, because they can't get off work any earlier to get out there to night school, and the only way to get there. So it was just a funny aside. But so we came out of law school and graduate school knowing each other, having a mutual respect, and had cooperated on solving problems. That's what Mr. Mack wanted, is a group of leaders that knew each other and could get things done behind the scenes. So one day, Walter Mischer and George Brown took me to lunch. They said, we understand you're close to Mickey Leland. And Mickey was he was an outlaw. Said, you explain to that dumb blankety blank 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 that every time he votes against the oil industry and it contracts, the first people that get laid off are his constituents. You know, and said he's giving a vote to a bunch of Yankees. They don't give him any votes on anything he's trying to get done. So why in the hell does he keep cutting off his nose, spite his face? I said, well, I can talk to him. I said, well, do. And so Mickey and I went to Washington. We went out. Mickey had a young aide that was on his staff, eventually rose chief of staff, named Rodney Ellis. And Rodney and I got to be friends because he was always Mickey's driver, and wherever we went, Rodney was hauling us around. I got a call from Mickey one day. He said, Rodney wants to run for city council. I said, that's great. He'd do a great job. So he wants me to back him. I told him I would if he can talk you into being finance chairman. And I said, well, he won't have a hard time doing that. I said, just a minute. I said, now you make him work for it. I said, because he doesn't know anything, and if he's going to be successful, he's got to listen to and do what you tell him. So get all that determined up front. Said, you know how youngster, you know, he knows just enough to be dangerous, and he doesn't know how Houston works. You're going to have to school him on all that and tell him who to meet and what to say and how to navigate. So Rodney came to see me, and I said, well, Rodney, we negotiated. I said, I'll help you, but on some conditions. You know, you're going to have to listen. You're going to have to, you got a lot to learn. Oh, yeah. I said, now, we're going to teach you how to raise money. Okay, how do you raise money? I said, tell me what your pitch is. He went into the thing, took him about 20 minutes to get it out. I said, the people I'm sending you to see are not going to listen to you for 20 minutes. I said, we need to get this down to where your pitch is under 3 minutes. And we honed on it and got it down. He said, okay, now. I said, you got your pitch down. He said, then what do I do? I said, nothing. He said, what do you mean nothing? What if they don't do anything? I said, just sit there and look at them. He said, you just sit and look at them? I said, you just sit there and look at them. So the first person I sent him to see was Walter Missioner. I talked to Walter, told him what was going on. And I said, he's going to make his pitch. And then he's just going to sit and look at you. He started laughing. He said, that's a good approach. He said, how long do you want me to look at him? I said, you're in charge, Chief. So he goes out there, and that was before cell phones. Rodney comes down, he calls me, he said, I just got a check from Walter Missioner. I said, it's wonderful. I said, how much is it? He said, I can't. He said, I'm afraid to open it. I said, well, you know, open it whenever you get ready. I'd be curious what he gave me. He opened it, he said, God damn. You know, I said, is it a good one? He said, far beyond my expectations. So I said, well, now you know how to raise money. You know, and I had him set up with 4 more calls where I, you know, told him what was going on. And it was the players, you know, that, so he started off, and there was a big field till we filed that first finance report. And everybody looked at that and said, son of a bitch, you know. It wasn't just how much he raised, but who he raised it from. And he's had the wind at his back ever since. But that's because of Mickey. And Rodney has been a good public servant, a great public servant, in my opinion. I get some heat on my side of the aisle from, you know, why are you helping so and so and so and so? And I said, because you can disagree with a man or a woman without being disagreeable. And no matter what, you need to communicate. And I learned that Dad, Mr. Mack, so when I was just a boy, they'd talk about, you know, well, so-and-so's going to oppose this, that. Dad would talk to one side, Mr. Mack would talk to the other side. They'd find where a consensus could be found, how to do it, and they cobbled it together. The things that I learned there is the same things I've been applying ever since through life. I don't always agree with Rodney. I didn't always agree with Mickey or Benny, but they have constituencies, and politics is about the art of the possible. And I would remind everyone that during the turbulent 60s, we navigated it pretty well here in Houston as compared to other cities. Major cities had riots, burned down. The nearest we came was when a police officer got shot out at TSU, and he may have been shot by one of his own guys. So, and that when that information got out, everyone seemed satisfied. That calmed down. I'm proud of the fact that we accomplished what we did in this city without any major riots. There's been some dark chapters. It's in that spirit, we've tried to engender and carry on, and I'm just spreading Mr. Mack's gospel, one of his disciples. If you look at Mickey's legislative history, when he first went up there, he did not get a lot passed. They have an expression up there referring to people as being housebroken. In other words, you go through the House representatives, you learn that you have to go along to get along. There's a lot of trading and swapping back and forth. And Mickey, as a young man, was righteous. It was the right thing to do, and God was on his side, and he was going to fight evil and preach at everyone. Well, everybody just says, really, it goes on about their business. And, at the end of the session, you're sitting there and, you got what the little boy shot at and nothing else. And you can't feed your constituents off of that. And I'm not trying to say it was because of me that a lot of people had a vested interest in seeing you succeed. I certainly did because of our friendship. But my job for Bill was to round up coalitions, and people were always amazed when Leland and some of his colleagues would come in and vote for something that we were doing. But all I would do is, they say, well, he's buying them off. Not at all. What I was doing was pointing out where his interests were in line with whatever they were trying to do. The blacks have historically been used. You know that. And I think they're still being used today. I'm critical of much of the Democratic Party because they take the blacks for granted. The blacks are loyal, vote with them in lockstep, and then they get what the little boy shot at. They're just, they're sucking hind tit when it comes time to, to everybody get fed. And it's not right. All I did was counsel Mickey and others on how to improve their leverage and their position, which benefited, my boss and what he was trying to get done. And Mickey, it didn't cost him anything, it didn't hurt his constituents, but it improved his leverage with people. When he needed help on something, I could go to somebody and say, hey, you remember when we did this, this, and this, and that situation's going to come up again. Now, he's looking for help here. And the guy that supposed he has an R behind his name, but he's a son of a bitch, and you and I both know it. And he screwed us on this, that, and the other. And the governor would say, I got it. Go do your thing. And Mickey learned how that game was played, and he applied that in Washington. Washington, there was lots more of that. They were more subtle in Washington. His first term up there, he got taken in, it's kind of like when wars come. The old politicians make the speeches and young men go out and do the fighting and dying. And Mickey was passionate and a true believer, and he did a lot of fighting and did a lot of dying till he got smarter in his later years, and then he got a lot of things done. It's just, I'm not trying to defend the system. I'm telling you it exists. It's there. Now you can either beat your head against the door, or you can figure out how to pick the lock and get in. Well, Mike Hanna taught me many things, but one of the greatest to us lessons is what power is and how to use it. And you got to remember, he was a black man in the 50s and 60s that had the odds stacked against him. He had to play the game and be subtle. When I was a boy, there were 2 restroom doors, black and colored and whites. Same thing on the drinking fountain. Schools, everything was segregated. You went to the movie theater in East Texas, and there was a movie theater, and then there was a stairway going up the back with a balcony, and that's where the coloreds sat. Now, in that world, and if that's how it is publicly, you can imagine how it is privately. And Mr. Mack acquired power and knew how to use it and got things done that people would have thought impossible. Mickey came along at a different phase in a different time where demonstrations, confrontation, lunch counter sit-ins, those kind of things became tactics that could work because they created a focus of attention, and a lot of people that hadn't paid a lot of attention, would say, well, that's not right. So we made some changes back then in our generation, and that's when Mickey came along in that period of time. But had not Mr. Mack plowed the ground that he had and taught the lessons, Martin Luther King, if you go back and read his books and what he had to say and what he did, he and Mr. Mack would, been like hands and gloves. And that was, it's one thing to preach and lecture. It's another thing to figure out how to get things done. Now, I admire people that got out and confronted and got their heads busted. But as General Patton said, I don't want you to die for your country. I want that other son of a bitch to die for his country. Said it's about winning here, not about, being brave and charging machine gun nests. Figure out a way to flank them and lob a grenade in there. Let that grenade do the talking for you. Mickey saw himself, and in his heart was a warrior for what he believed in. And he was always uncomfortable. It's like I'm talking to the enemy. I said, Mickey, have you ever been to a sausage plant? If you go to a sausage plant, you'll never want to eat sausage again. Now, you've chosen politics as your avocation and your vocation, and you're going to have to learn how sausage is made and get over being squeamish about it if you're going to make sausage and sell sausage. Well, it does, and you and I sitting here, Mickey had a hard time. That was the biggest hump for him to get over. I'd be sitting next to him, and, you'd look over at his old, his hands getting, I could see white all over his knuckles where he's hanging under his leg, and you could look at his cheek, and, you can see muscles flexing up there. Mickey's basic nature is he liked people, and people liked him. Mickey, I enjoyed his company, and he was just a fun guy to be with. And he could crack me up. And we'd talk about people we were dealing with on both sides of the fence and talk candidly about them. Players, it's like when you play football or basketball or whatever. When you're out there on the court, you're just trying to beat each other's brains out. But that's the same guys you go out and have a beer with later, and there's a camaraderie among players.
Right. Yep.
It's the same.
Again, let me start by saying what a pleasure and honor to be here and to be amongst so many people, including Texas Southern University students, and of course the curator, the archivist or digital leader of the wonderful library that reflects both Barbara Jordan and Mickey Leland. Dean, it's a pleasure to be with you. Associate Dean, a pleasure. Students, I know that we will meet. VFBennett is the living historian of all of us. Without his presence, Virgil has really been the storyteller, the truth teller. His knowledge of the Honorable Barbara Jordan, his knowledge of his dear, dear, dear beloved friend Mickey, of which he stayed so closely by, one would say under his wings, and then continued to be the nurturer of the 18th Congressional District. That's the way Mickey led his life, that injuries, devastation, dismissing, ignoring the pain of people just couldn't happen on his watch. And I imagine that his classmate would say as a little boy, Mickey was unique and different, because you don't just gain that and pop up as a member of Congress. It really is in you, and I'm glad that Judge Petronella mentioned Mickey's faith, because he did. And I really believe that his faith drove him to be the activist that he was and is in his life. His faith, and of course his loving mother. For those of us who knew Alice Raines, knew his brother, Mickey loved his family. His mother was his queen. was his guiding force, was his educator, because she was an educator, but she educated those boys at home as well, and was his guiding force. I think that's important to make sure we know about Alice Raines. We loved her. I'm so glad to have been, for her to have been alive during the period after Mickey's death, because we loved her. And of course, his death for her was devastating. He loved his family, always wanted to be a father, and was so excited when his firstborn was born, and he obviously did not live to see the birth of his twins. Loved his wife. But I say all that to say that when he came out of his house, he was Mickey Leland, and he was ready to go. He was ready to make deals. He was ready to interact with the community. He was ready to get things done. He was ready to mentor. One of the things that I think we miss with this society of technology, and Mickey had a gaggle of folk hanging around. And we're around, and it's not seen as something to do anymore. Maybe it's not awesome, it's not hip, but it is such an experience to be able to be around people. I was a grown person when I sat in the office of Barbara Jordan. I will still talk about that experience, a grown young person, because it was an amazing experience to be in her office in Washington. You could see her here, but in her office in Washington as a member of the United States Congress. I encourage young people who may be listening. Mickey is 77 and he is gone. But there are people around that you miss because you are, I'm not sure, not embracing and understanding the value of walking history. We understood it. And I understood being around Mickey when he came home in the district. And I certainly did not have the experience of starting in school. But there was a gaggle of young elected officials or people not elected, really, because I wasn't elected, that would gaggle around, use the terminology, Mickey Leland. You wanted to learn. So when Mickey Leland brought the Congressional Black Caucus here, frankly, we thought we had died and gone to heaven, because he brought all these members that we were just in awe. John Conyers, Ron Dellums was here. If I could call them, Bill Gray. And some people were saying these numbers, you know, who are these people? Shirley Chisholm. He brought them here, much smaller Congressional Black Caucus. And so I don't know if plenty makes people think it's just an old shoe, it's just a member of Congress. But it's iconic, not because the person deserves a pedestal to be placed up. It is the walking knowledge. And so we were clamoring just to be in the room. My good friend Charlie Rangel, you can imagine what I thought when I got to the United States Congress, to be with Mickey's friends, and that's what I called them. Charlie Rangel, Mickey Leland, Ron Dellums, they were all eager to say they were Mickey's friends, because they were there in the dark days or the small days, or the days when they had to organize and use Bill Klay. I want to call all these names. Curtis Collins, who I got to serve with a little bit. Ron, I got to serve with a little bit. John Conyers for a longer period of time. Charlie Rangel. Look at all these names. They walked in that United States Congress. They were, how could I say it? People were like, let me look at you. Because there was nothing like them around. Nothing like members of Congress. And then Mickey came from, and Barbara came from the Deep South. Barbara was the first, Mickey the second. Since Reconstruction. Who wouldn't want to be around? And then he brought this sense of humanitarianism that just filled his soul. Mickey, of course, went to the state legislature. I was a peon and wasn't around anyway. Now, I think Mickey took to things like standing on tables, but they had to get the attention of folk who also looked at them like, who are these people? We've never seen these people in the state legislature since Reconstruction, even at that time. Just try to understand how special Mickey was and how he made himself from a boy out of Fifth Ward, Texas, to the iconic presence in the United States Congress that when I came, people wanted to say they were friends of Mickey Leland. more about the Select Committee on Hunger. It had never been done. There was a Select Committee on Drugs, and then this committee that was done bipartisan. That's a big word. And that was Congressman Emerson from a place far away, Kansas, from Mickey's concept of Houston, Texas, and the nickel. And they got together. He was on the Agricultural Committee. But it was really a sense of hunger being an evil that they knew that America had a responsibility to stamp out. We still fight hunger today. But the Mickey Leland Hunger Commission is still very much alive, of which I've been on the board since coming to the United States Congress. It has interns and fellows. It has members of Congress who support it. It gets funding to do work about hunger around the world. And it was his friends in Ethiopia, or from Ethiopia, here in Houston, who found him. If I might, I can say the reason why David Petronella found a son of Ethiopia, because it seemed that they found their way to places like taxis, even to the extent later of owning a bunch of them. But you could find taxis around America driven by Ethiopian immigrants. But Mickey Leland made friends and understood Eritrea, Ethiopia, and South Sudan, Somalia, areas that most people could not even consider. And Mickey was without fear, but Mickey also legislated. And I think it's important for you to know what legislation is. Our time frame in the United States Congress is different from that of the state legislature. It takes years to get anything done. You could file a bill 5 years ago and you're excited about the fact that it was finally signed by the president in its 10th year. It moves slow. And when you come to a time like this, that Mickey, thank goodness, did not see, when there is such a divide, such divisiveness, such lack of understanding, it takes longer. But the one thing about Mickey's era is, as I said, he was fearless, and no one was going to be a person that wasn't a friend. So no matter what your political beliefs were, he was going to find a way to do legislation with you. And so there is a Mickey Leland center in the medical center dealing with air pollution and asthma. Mickey was on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and he worked on health issues. Mickey was big before the Affordable Care Act could even be pronounced to talk about why people didn't have health care. And he found people to work on. Mickey chaired the Congressional Black Caucus. I chaired the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. The 18th Congressional District, though way down here in Houston, Texas, was well known. And then, of course, was his international mission. I already told you there was never a person that was not his friend. There was never a person who was an international person that was not his friend. There was never a person who came from a place of depression and devastation. There was never a person who suffered discrimination that was not his friend and who he did not fight for. And if I offer anything about his spirit and the reason why the world still looks to his archives, it's because they want to know what makes up America. And the reason why people still to this day continue to admire America are for the persons like Mickey Leland. They always have hope that America will be what she says she is, what that Constitution calls her to be, that ordering a more perfect union, or insisting on promoting certain inalienable rights, which was the Declaration of Independence, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that you can come here and be someone. And with Mickey, you could be someone. I talked about his journeys on the weekend, well, he was always putting together someone to run for something. So by being part of the gaggle, you were going to get called. And it would be something that you weren't even thinking about. I'm honored that he called me. I know Rodney Ellis is honored to have been called and to have been someone who he worked with. Commissioner Ellis is just leaving out of Atlanta, where he was meeting with Martin King III. I wanted you all to know of his love and enduring affection for Mickey Leland. Started working for him in 1980, and he says that he is still working for him. He said he's still following him. During his work, he learned to follow Mickey Leland, and that's what happens to those of us who were around him. We can remember stories. So mine, of course, was being part of the gaggle and getting that call about running for office. And obviously it wasn't for Congress. So he saw things in people that caused them to think of things that they had never thought of. And of course, we fight every day to try to have that kind of spirit. He was, as I said, tough. He took no prisoners, and you learned a lot from that. But I think it's important to know that he was a legislator. He did understand compromise. He did generate legislation. And something that many of you don't know, Congressman Mickey Leland filed the first bill on creating what is now the African American Culture and History Museum in Washington, D.C. I might say, along with the Martin Luther King Monument, the most visited museum and most visited museum under the Smithsonian family. It is unbelievable, the visitors that come to the Smithsonian. They were clamoring during the pandemic for it to be open. I had one of the largest receptions there with about 2,000 to 3,000 people when I chaired the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, because so many people wanted to come and just be inside of that museum. Mickey Leland filed the legislation to establish a slaves museum, a museum to tell the story about slaves. And out of that, tragically, because he did not live, he was not able to pursue it, but it was picked up by John Robert Lewis, who then carried it as a museum of the culture and history of African Americans. Mickey Leland is also in that museum because of his creation of that legislation. And when we debated it, as I was the only member of Congress from here, the state of Texas, from this region, to be an original co-sponsor of the museum, having come at that time, but we debated, and I insisted that they include Mickey Leland in the story of this museum and made sure that the legislative history would include how he was the foundation of this museum. Legislation is very important. So I ask you to get part of a gaggle of someone in the tradition of Mickey Leland and to make sure that you understand him more than the big bush that he had for a number of years and the good-looking suits and the friendship he had with the Reverend Jesse Jackson, strong, deep friendship, Andy Young, the admiration that Walter Mondale had for him, Jimmy Carter had for him, and the big shoes that he had in national politics, but the big affection that he had for the world and his beloved Ethiopia and the Ethiopian people and all of Africa. He was a giant in his time. I'm glad to have had just a few short years to say that I was part of the gaggle. And when I say that, the years were not short, they were long, but I consider them in the context of his life. But I'm glad to have been there in the gaggle, there in the crowd that could follow him around during the weekends that he would come home during his time here, and to be able to, if you will, I think I will end on this note. In those days when Mickey was missing and all of us had our phones, hardline phones, because there weren't many cell phones, we were by the phones because not one of us not one, ever thought that Mickey would not pop up. Not one. And we waited and waited and waited. That's the kind of strength, determination, presence, the aura, kingliness, and greatness that Mickey Leland had in our hearts. We would not accept anything less than Mickey coming back.
I am Aljanita Scott Davis. I'm a native Fifth Wardian. I was born on Lyons Avenue, so I am very, very familiar with a lot of the history that happened in Fifth Ward in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. It was my pleasure to meet the Congressman because Mickey Leland was then in the state legislature. Mickey Leland was a representative and came into the state legislature with an entire group of individuals who discovered how to make a difference. It was a big change for Houston to have elected officials going to the state. So we not only had Barbara Jordan going to the state Senate, but we had a cadre of individuals, the Mickey Lelands, the Anthony Halls, the Craig Washingtons, the Symphonia Thompsons, those individuals that all went into the state of Texas legislature together. I met him in the auditorium of E.O. Smith Junior High School, which was Wheatley High School prior to the fact that he was and I were enrolled there. Mickey was about 6 or 7 years ahead of me in school, but he was in the class with my cousin, Earl Shepard, and Wesley Plummer, Dr. Matthew Wesley Plummer, Al Calloway, and a lot of the people who were very, very active in the 60s and 61 class of Phyllis Wheatley, including Dr. Etta Francis Walker. I need to definitely mention her. So there was some kind of political event, and of course, in Fifth Ward, and being from Fifth Ward, and having returned to Fifth Ward from law school, I attended that event. There was a person who worked for him named Alfranco Lee. Alfranco was my schoolmate at E.O. Smith and at Wheatley. So that's how I got a chance to meet the then legislative state representative, George Mickey Leland. As the state representative, Mickey Leland had done a lot for the community. So at the time that Congresswoman Barbara Jordan decided that she would retire from her position, Mickey was the first to announce. And in fact, on the day that Barbara Jordan announced she was coming out of Congress, he held a news conference and announced he was running for that position because he felt he was the best person to do so. Of course, Mickey was from Fifth Ward, but my brother-in-law, Judson Robinson, had me as his treasurer. So here I was, a Fifth Ward person, working very closely with somebody who was very much affiliated with Pleasantville and Third Ward. And so all of my Fifth Ward friends would tease me during the election. It was Judson Robinson, Anthony Hall, and Mickey Leland. So that was a great big deal, and the city from north to south had to make a decision. So my good friend, artist C. Boy Vaughn, who attended Wheatley with the then legislative representative, would tease me all the time. And of course, he would call me up, and as soon as my brother-in-law was, the first person to call me was C-Boy to tell me, aha, you were forsaking your Fifth Ward roots, and that's what you get. And that's why you were backing this candidate. C-Boy was very politically active, very much involved in the history, worked for the Forward Times, wrote article after article after article, but very, very involved in the community and was a staunch activist for a lot of the progressive activities going on in Fifth Ward. So it was natural that he would be supporting the then coming into place Congressman Mickey Leland. The election, of course, allowed us to see some of our talented, experienced politicians to actually consider what they had brought to the city, what they were involved in, their backgrounds, and of course the congressman had touched not only the people in Fifth Ward that he represented in Cashmere Gardens on the north side, but he had very, very strong alliances with those who were in the Third Ward area. He was also very much involved with the Hispanic community. He spoke Spanish. He was very close to Ben Reyes. He was very much involved in the arts community because he loved art, and he had worked with the Manils and gotten them to participate and support a lot of Fifth Ward projects and a lot of projects across the city. So it was because he had such a wide variety of interests that I'm sure propelled him into the position, along with the money, frankly, of becoming our congressman. As the congressman, he knew what power was. That was when I first got a chance to watch him in action. During the 1988 election, we had a slate of African Americans and Hispanics who were running for judicial positions. There were some 13 or 14 of them, and back then we actually collaborated with each other to see who could run for those positions. The election night, the computers went down suddenly at 9 o'clock, came back up at 10:30, and of course, all of the Hispanic and African American candidates lost by 1.5%, equally across the board. Well, of course, we were suspicious about it, and we demanded a recount. But a recount costs money, $65,000. Who came up with the money? Mickey Leland. Mickey Leland said, we have to make sure that they know that we are going to check them out. So he went and borrowed the money to make sure that we were able to do that recount. So I got a chance to see his power and his commitment to not only his position, not only a congressional position or a state position, but to the fact that we needed something in the courtroom that was black and brown other than the furniture, the chairs, and the robes. And those were the kinds of things that Mickey taught when he explained to us that it was extremely important that we have judges in these positions. We did the recount. Of course, ultimately, it came out that the Harris County would have been correct, which is what Harris County would say, that it's correct, especially back then in '88. And that recount supported the litigation that we filed against the state of Texas. So as president of Houston Lawyers Association, I filed a Houston Lawyers Association versus the state of Texas, and we also joined with the Mexican American Bar Association, MABA, and filed a companion suit. We were represented by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that did so on a pro bono basis, but the basis for our lawsuit was that recount that Mickey had paid for. By then, it was '89. So during '88 and '89, my niece, Patrice Yvonne Johnson, worked for the congressman. She ran his office, was very active as his legislative director, lived in Washington, but her home base and her home address was my house. So I got a chance to be involved in everything that Mickey was doing during the years of '87, '88, '89, because Patrice was working with him. So that meant I worked on his Congressional Black Caucus visit to Houston, where he did a big, huge dinner at the Shamrock. We did seminars. We put together tours for the Congressional Black Caucus. It was a big deal. I don't think the Congressional Black Caucus had ever met outside of Washington until Mickey invited them to Houston. And it was in January sometime. It was during the winter months. So it was a great time to be here. And it was a very, very successful conference. But it also demonstrated that his fellow members of Congress had a lot of faith and a lot of belief in what Mickey was trying to do as he demonstrated their power, it goes back to power again, here in Houston, Texas. Mickey left a tremendous impression on me about how to not only use the power that he had, but to share the benefits of power. He made sure that people got a chance to participate in a lot of opportunities simply because Mickey had made the contacts. He was bold. He would know who somebody was. He would get a chance to meet them. Every class that I have here at the university, and this is my 7th year, I talk to my students about getting to know everyone in the class. and how it's so important to know how to network, to know your classmates, to know everybody at Texas Southern University, because you never know who that classmate is going to be. And the example that I give them is the relationship that the Congressman built with Milton Carroll. Milton Carroll ultimately became the chair of the board of this university. He constantly brings individuals from the corporate environment back to this university. But Milton Carroll started off as a person recommended to the Port Commission, where I worked, by Mickey Leland. It was because of the relationship that they had as Texas Southern University students that carried them into the business world. So you will see example after example and hear testimony after testimony about how Mickey made sure that people who were around him, people that he knew, people that he would meet, would get a chance to benefit from those business opportunities simply because of his connection. And to this day, I'm sure Milton will tell you that that is the person who made the biggest difference in his life and that started him on a tremendous ascension up the corporate ladder into the boardroom and the chairmanships of major corporations in this country. Back to my whole discussion about power, to talk about how the congressman used his power on a worldwide basis. That was what took him to Ethiopia. The congressman had pushed and pushed and pushed to get legislation passed to make sure that aid would be received by refugees who had come into Ethiopia because there were all kinds of civil wars and other issues happening in the nearby countries, and I'm not sure which countries were they, but these individuals were living in squalid conditions and really, really needed humanitarian aid. And the congressman, because he had a world vision, a vision well beyond the 18th Congressional District, well beyond the streets of Fifth Ward, he had that vision that these people deserve the support. So he was able to get that done through a lot of machinations and making sure that the transportation was made available and getting the additional funding for the transportation, millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. But what he wanted to do, he wanted to see that that was happening. He wanted to make sure and confirm personally that was happening. So he took a trip. And that's how he got to Ethiopia, along with the other individuals that were going there to make sure that the aid was being delivered. Not hijacked by somebody, not being used by rulers, but that this aid he was making sure that individuals who had committed to deliver it were accountable. And for that, he gave his life. It's very, very important that it was the world vision that took him beyond the boundaries of this country and the boundaries of his neighborhood. And that was the vision that ultimately led to his demise on the plane crash. But what it did was it elevated his memory. It made sure that we remembered him not just for what he did here, but what he did for others. He used his vision and his power. When the African American Museum opened last year, or whenever it opened, one of the things that Congressman John Lewis said as he opened his remarks was that we have to stop and pause to give thanks to Congressman Mickey Leland. Now here it is, 30 years after his death, but Mickey, in June of 1989, introduced legislation to create a National Museum of African American History. And that idea, which another congressman had mentioned years and years ago, but had not gotten to the point of actually getting legislation done, that legislation was brought to the fore and actually introduced by the congressman. So although he did not get a chance to see it here or to be celebrated at the time of its opening, it's important that we remember him and that the museum does not just talk about African Americans in this country. It talks about why Africans are in this country and how they got to this country, and that they came from the motherland and from the country through very, very tortuous circumstances. And because that museum explains that, we have to really thank the Congressman for knowing that our existence really goes back to the motherland and to the continent of Africa, where ultimately he gave his life.
There is something special about tonight. What is different? What is special? I, Barbara Jordan, am a keynote speaker.
1956, Texas Southern graduate Barbara Jordan kicked down barriers to become the first African-American woman elected to Congress from the Deep South. 1970, Texas Southern graduate Mickey Leland was elected to Congress and led the fight against poverty and hunger worldwide. They developed the skills to make history and change the world at Texas Southern University. TSU continues their legacy at the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs, offering degrees in Administration of Justice, Public Affairs and Administration, Urban Planning and Environmental Policy, Political Science, and now an Executive Master's in Public Administration online. For more information, contact Dr. Michael O. Adams at 713-313-7760 or online at tsu.edu. Enter the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs as a student. Leave as a leader with the skills to change the world.